What makes a fierce warrior fiercer than fighting with a sword and shield? Disregarding all personal safety and using both hands on the weapon. Vikings, among others, have a reputation of being particularly fierce warriors. So did they ever use two-handed swords? Short answer, no. Long answer,
no. Reality is often disappointing.
And here's the even longer answer. But first, I'll tell you about Skillshare, the sponsor of this video. It's an online learning community that offers thousands of creative classes on video making, photography, design, freelancing, etc. It's suited for all kinds of experience levels and schedules. Here's a class that Matt Easton would love. Context is key. The productivity category is one that I should look at. Focusing attention and managing time are not exactly my strengths. For example, Productivity Today, Managing Attention in the Digital Age by Kevin Siskar covers strategies for holding yourself accountable and also tools like to-do list apps. The first 1,000 of you to click the link in the video description will get a free trial of premium membership, so you can hop in your virtual longship and raid the Isles of Learning. Do they have classes on how to make better analogies? Anyway, there's plenty of potential for personal growth, so check it out below. I use the term two-handed sword loosely there, simply meaning any sword used with both hands. The terminology is somewhat complex. The term two-handed sword generally refers to what you would call a Zweihänder, a sword of such size that you can't use it effectively with one hand. You have to use both hands. Hand-and-a-half sword, also called bastard sword, is a sword that can be used either way, with either one or two hands. There's also the term longsword. The way I personally use the terms is a matter of emphasis. A longsword, to my mind, is a sword that is used primarily with two hands, but can also be used with one hand in certain circumstances. A hand-and-a-half or bastard sword I see as really more of a single-handed sword that can also be used with two. So I'd rather combine a hand-and-a-half sword with a shield than a longsword, if that makes sense. Now, an oakshot type 13 greatsword of war could in theory be fitted with a Viking style hilt without negatively impacting its functionality. But keep in mind, it is a later type of sword from the 13th century and onward. So in the Viking Age, 793 to 1066, people used single-handed swords. If you look at any of the typologies available, you'll see short handles, generally. There's just some variation. Some handles are a little longer, some are a little shorter. There's different hilt styles, obviously, but generally you cannot fit two hands on there. There's a clear lineage connecting Viking swords to earlier Germanic migration era swords. Same overall design. A lot of people seem to really like the idea of a two-handed Viking sword. You often see reproductions in that direction where they simply extend the handle quite a bit and turn it into a two-handed sword, or hand and a half, depending on the length. So that's fantasy. How about history? Occasionally you see these pop up right here. These are Nordic style swords, which are actually from the early 16th century. So you could see these as retro swords, basically. They reminisced of an earlier age and styled them accordingly. These were ceremonial swords. They weren't even intended for actual use on the battlefield or in duels or what have you. This is what two-handed Viking swords could have looked like if they had existed. But then there's this one right here. This is a sword from Latvia. This is apparently quite a long handle, but it's visually misleading because it has a rather narrow blade and a pretty small lower guard. By the way, lower and upper guard, you have to look at the sword like this with the pommel up. So the lower guard is what you would simply call guard normally, and then the upper guard is the pommel and sometimes the other piece that would be called the upper guard that you often see on swords of this type. The upper and lower guard on Viking period swords was sometimes mounted incorrectly by museum curators, leading to some confusion. In this case, there was likely an upper guard made of antler, bone, or wood, or some other organic material that simply decayed and wasn't preserved. So if you imagine that being in place, suddenly the grip isn't so long anymore. So this wouldn't actually allow space for the other hand. And this is a statement by Peter Johnson, who is a highly skilled and experienced swordsmith and designer behind Albion's museum line, who has worked with a lot of historical originals and reconstructed them. He's done plenty of research. If Peter frickin' Johnson tells you that he's very not convinced that there were two-handed swords in the Viking Age, one does not simply go, actually. Okay, so no two-handed Viking swords in actual history. Why not? Well, the simple and obvious answer is this right here. Shield. I'll talk a little bit about two-handed weapons that were actually used at the time. But this is a pretty obvious one on the battlefield, especially if you encounter archers, which the Vikings did. They used bows and encountered bows. So if there are arrows flying about on the battlefield, you don't necessarily just want to run around with your hands just on the weapon and no defensive measure. The shield was the bread and butter defensive tool for most of history, really. It started in the Bronze Age, then in antiquity, the Greeks, the Romans, migration era, etc., Vikings later on. The shield was always very important on the battlefield, because not only does it protect you, it also protects the guy to your left and to your right, and allows you to adopt defensive formations that can't simply be pushed aside or riddled with arrows, etc. That's also why you generally don't see dual-wielding weapons in a battlefield context outside of very specific situations, like your shield broke and all you have near you right now is weapons, so you just pick up another one to fight with that. But even that is not terribly likely, because chances are there are going to be other shields lying around as well. Interestingly, there are some historical references to using a single-handed sword with both hands. Not this fashion in particular, as an example, although on here I could even potentially cram another hand onto the pommel. So with some swords you can grip the pommel and get a little bit of extra space there. In case of Viking swords, there are mentions in the Icelandic sagas of, for example, a shield being hacked to pieces, discarded, and then the sword being gripped with both hands. So you can either wrap the offhand around the main hand, or you could put it on the wrist. This is also done in Chinese swordsmanship. And here's an example from circa 1200. The knight on the left side of this painting can be seen using both hands on the single-handed sword. This could be used to deliver more powerful strikes against mail armor. And of course, as armor developed, so did weapon designs. You got longer handles that allow you to place both hands together on the sword comfortably. And then eventually they got longer to the point where you even had a bit of space between the hands, and then you eventually arrive at these mid-15th century Danish two-handed swords, true two-handed swords, or great swords, if you want to call them that. So Scandinavian two-handed swords and longswords existed, just not Viking ones. So what you saw in the 13th Warrior is pure fantasy. Now, not that anything that appears in that movie is historically accurate for the Viking period, but that's movies for you. So what about this? The Dane Axe. Used with two hands, because quite frankly, trying to wield such a large, long axe with one hand is a little bit silly, would not be particularly effective. So two-handed weapons were used on the battlefield. These are a little later than a lot of people often think. This is really toward the end of the Viking Age and beyond. So you can find them in the 10th century, and then they became quite popular in the 11th century, very iconic in the Battle of Hastings. They're shown in the Bayeux tapestry, although in the hands of Anglo-Saxon warriors, not Vikings in that case. And in the Byzantine Empire, the Varangian Guard used these several centuries later. Speaking of the Byzantines, I found examples of long-handled swords that they used between the 2nd and 8th century. And you do find two-handed weapons of some sort here and there in antiquity. You know, the falx obviously is an example of Rhomphaia, and over in China in a similar time period in the Chu and Han dynasty, just to name a few examples. Now, why would you ditch the shield, such a valuable defensive weapon, on a Viking battlefield? Well, first off, you don't even necessarily have to ditch it altogether. You can sling it on your back. Now you have both hands free to use the axe, and if need be, you can turn it and still deploy the shield to defend yourself. And in case of arrows, basically, you turn your back or you swing it over to your shoulder, things like that. And that is also shown in the Bayeux tapestry. There is an axeman who also has a shield slung across his shoulder, and there's a number of arrows in that shield, so it has found good use. But the other axemen in the same depiction do not have a shield. So how often this was done, I can't tell you. I don't know if it's even possible to know with any degree of certainty. Aha, you might say. If they could use an axe like this with a shield, they could have used a two-handed sword as well, right? Sure, they could have. So here's my speculation as to why they didn't. In the high and late Middle Ages and the Renaissance, armor had become so advanced and so commonly available that you could get away with using a two-handed weapon on the battlefield. You're probably well enough armored to get away with that without ending up a pincushion. In the Viking Age, considering the armor available at the time, and also considering that most Viking warriors wouldn't be able to afford a lot of armor, if any, or just simple padded armor, etc., things like that, the shield was very important. So you couldn't just have an entire army full of axe wielders, because they would just be decimated by archers. So other than a specialized shock troop whose purpose it is to break up enemy formations, this could also be used as backup in the rear ranks. Because if the first row is equipped with shields, somebody with a Dane Axe would be able to stand behind that, behind the protection of those shields, and still strike with the axe. And they could do that much more effectively with an axe than with a sword. For one, if you swing this past somebody, this is not very likely to endanger them, because the axe haft isn't going to pose much of a threat to them. But more importantly, you can use this to hook the opponent's shields. You can hook the shield down, disturb their defense, and then the guys in the front can exploit that and attack those openings that you just created. With a sword, you can't do that. You can't hook into the shield and drag it around, pull it down, etc. So this is the more effective tool for providing backup, the same way as a spear. And a spear, of course, would have a lot more reach than a sword, so that is also more useful in that regard. So the axe, the two-handed axe fit in better with this kind of warfare than a two-handed sword would have at the time. At least that's how I interpret it. That's my thoughts on it. Do your own research. Again, no appeal to authority fallacy. I'm not an expert, I'm an enthusiast. And do your own research. Don't take my word for it. But either way, I hope you found it interesting and entertaining. That's the point. And don't let anyone spoil your Viking-inspired two-handed fantasy sword. If it's cool, it's cool. Just don't claim that it's historical. That's all. So thanks for watching, and have a good one, folks.